Those of you who are parents or grandparents, who have children or have been children, which is to say all of us, are likely familiar with something that I call the I don't want to's. Recall a scenario like this one. You're helping a child get ready for school. Your child likes school. They have friends who they're eager to see. You've made them breakfast. Maybe it's something simple like cinnamon toast or oatmeal, or maybe it's a special day, which in my house tends to mean pancakes. Doesn't really matter. There is exciting chatter about the day. And then, when it comes time to put on shoes and head out the door, I don't want to. I hate school. What had seemed like it was going to be a pleasant, dare I say, even easy morning, has been transformed into an epic battle. There is gnashing of teeth, rending of garments, and then finally, yes, you and the child leave the home, and it turns out they don't hate school after all. The I don't want to's are a reaction to change. When we're little, we humans tend to hate change. We tend to dislike the moments of transition from one thing to the next. Actually, if we're honest, it's probably true that transitions are always the hardest part of life. One of the reasons why we humans have created religious communities like this one is to help us manage the transitions, big and small. It's actually my experience that the time that people most often come to church is when they're undergoing some sort of transition in their life. And it's not uncommon to encounter people who only enter our sanctuary to celebrate weddings, attend memorial services, or be a witness to a child dedication. It seems that ritual provides us with a sense of comfort when we're trying to navigate significant events. Rituals offer a sense of structure, a feeling of community, a reminder that while our own lives are unique, they're part of a larger story that we share with all humans and indeed all living things. It's like we sang in our earlier hymn, as a child is born, the old must die. A time for joy, a time to cry. It is the repetition of ritual that helps ease change. A new life has come among us. It will be unlike any that has ever been before. With so much unknown, we know this way, this set of repeated activities, this way of spending time together that forms a ritual to grate this new being into our community. A life has been lost, a vibrant soul is no more, has gone on to join the ancestors and become a blessed memory. With so much lost, we've decided to come together to share, to reflect, and to be with each other, to remind each other that in our mourning we are never truly alone. You've probably learned something about this when dealing with the I don't want to's and helping the child out the door, whether that child was you or you were the parent. You likely figured out that there was a certain ritual of some kind that helped to motivate them along, a silly song, an order of putting one's shoes and coats and boots on and tying the laces. It doesn't really matter. The important thing is that in both daily life and when confronted with the bigger shifts we experience, ritual provides a sense of stability, routine, and meaning. I mention all this because our Unitarian Universalist Association is in the process of undergoing a consequential change. Right now, we're considering rewriting Article 2 of the bylaws. Now, this might seem like an obtuse, banal, or overly bureaucratic subject for a sermon, but it is actually of significant experience because religious significance, because Article 2 is where the principles and sources of the association, which we just recited earlier, reside. For a lot of us, it represents the clearest statement of Unitarian Universalist theology. And the proposed changes to Article 2 are significant. They entirely replace the existing principles and sources with statements of vision and covenant and inspiration. The eighth principle, which has been under discussion as an addition to the current principles, would be revised into its own section titled Inclusion. The dramatic nature of the intended alterations to Article 2 has prompted a lot of reaction. People affiliated with our congregation have been emailing me or asking to talk with me at the rate of at least once a week for the last 2 months or so. After I attended a session on the proposed changes to Article 2 last autumn, I was inspired to send the commissioners a 4-page letter of my commentary. Some of you are opposed to the prospect of changing the principles and purposes. Others of you think the new text is just great. Some of you even told me you don't know what all the fuss is about. But it is important to be supportive of the process of revising Article 2 because it is an expression of our fundamental process, theological work as Unitarian Universalists. Even though, for many of us, the first reaction to the new text is a case of the I don't want tos. It's important to recognize that the principles as we currently have them only came into existence in 1987. I grew up with them. They're a familiar and easy introduction to Unitarian Universalism that many of you likely know well. I don't necessarily want to let them go. There's, of course, a bit of irony here. Unitarian Universalism has always had something of a contradiction at its core. A core element of our tradition is openness to change. That was not meant supposed to be a laugh line, but and some of you might remember that I like to quote Joanne Braxton and Rebecca Parker and others who point out that for Unitarian Universalists, revelation is not sealed. We're always taking in new experiences and trying to make sense of them within our theology. The early 20th century Universalist preacher L.B. Fisher had words about our faith when asked to define it that I like to quote sometimes, saying, "We do not defend any immovable theological positions. We grow as all living things must. The main question is, which way are we moving? Which way are we moving?" And here comes the contradiction. We are a tradition committed to change. Traditions are supposed to be, for the most part, about preserving patterns of belief and worship from generation to generation. And yet Unitarian Universalism is always seeking to adapt to a changing world. This tension between change and tradition, between the past and the present, is what scholars call a mediating tradition. It means that we're always attempting to bridge the gap between science and religion, history and the future, the secular and the sacred, theological innovation and ritual consistency. This contradiction means that as a tradition, we are sometimes caught up in fighting our own desire to change. We attempt to reframe this by taking Unitarian Universalism as a living tradition, not something that is taken as fixed for all times, but something that we live into within our lifetimes. As the late Andrea Williams put it, if we believe in the promise of our faith, we must continue pushing forward, even if the reality makes us want to give up or be uncomfortable. Alandria was the co-moderator of the Unitarian Universalist Association, who, along with co-moderator Barb Greer, established the commission to study and probably revise Article 2. They believed that the nature of our tradition is openness to change. And so a couple years back, they called us to begin to reconsider changing the principles and sources of our association. As I mentioned earlier, the current iteration of the principles and sources only dates to 1987. Their relatively contemporary language leads to experience I sometimes have when meeting new members or frequent visitors to the congregation who are curious to learn more about Unitarian Universalism. It's witnessing the reaction of surprise that they, or perhaps I should say you, have when you learn that Unitarian Universalism is a venerable movement with historical roots. Oh, the vibrations. Oh, the Unitarians, apostate seminarians, grok the groovy. What the consternation, arise ye antediluvians, groove on. Tom Wolfe's famous 1960s tongue-and-cheek description of Unitarian Universalism is typical of that impression that our religious communities came out of the 1960s counterculture. Or that at the very most, they have their origins in the same period that gave birth to new religious movements like the Baha'i or Unity. In my conversations, I always try to offer a different perspective and point out that the oldest Unitarian congregations have their roots in the 16th century, and the oldest Universalist ones date back to the 18th century. It's true that these communities, when they formed, were Christian, but the earliest Unitarians in North America were covenantal, not creedal. And while they could not imagine that any member of their community would be anything other than Christian, they differed significantly on what it meant to be Christian and had differing understandings about Jesus and God and humanity that they debated at great length. Over time, these differences became great enough that many of them stopped identifying as Christian and called themselves transcendentalists or religious humanists or atheists. And in time, this caused them to widen their circles large enough to welcome people without roots in Christianity who practiced Islam or Hinduism or Buddhism. The Universalists, for their part, believed in universal salvation. They held that God's love was all-encompassing, all-powerful, and all-embracing. Mark Morrison Reed has described how historically Universalism came to be called the gospel of God's success. Picturesquely spoken, he wrote, the image was that of the last unrepentant sinner being dragged kicking and screaming into heaven, unable to resist the loving power of the Almighty. Eventually, this emphasis on the overwhelming love of God led the Universalists, like the Unitarians, to stop worrying about whether someone identified as a Christian in their communities became theologically inclusive as well. In the middle of the 20th century, the Unitarians and the Universalists decided that they had more in common than they had that kept them different, and had both reached a point where ethical action rather than belief was at the center of their traditions. And so in 1961, the American Unitarian Association and the Universalist Church of America consolidated. Now, this history is likely familiar to many of you. I offer it because some of you are new to the congregation, and it can be helpful also at a time like this to have a bit of historical perspective on how Unitarian Universalism has changed over time. These changes have often been expressed in different historical statements of faith that various Unitarian Universalist and Unitarian Universalist communities have made. The current principles are just the most recent expression of these. Some of these documents actually use language and have theological concepts that I suspect many of you might blanch at a little bit. The 1605 Rakovian Catechism, an influential early text along these lines, describes the aim of religious life as attaining eternal life, and spills a great deal of ink on the nature of the Christian faith and the office of Jesus Christ. The Salem Covenant of 1629, from which we get so much of our practice of making covenants, refers to a decision to bind ourselves in the presence of God. That early Unitarian community took their tradition to be so living that just 7 years later, in 1636, they decided to revise it entirely. 1790, you can find a statement from the Universalist Convention in Philadelphia that professes a deep and unchanging commitment to the universal love of God to mankind. In 1830, you can find another expression, and so on and so forth. There have been a great many attempts to summarize the non-creedal nature of our tradition over the centuries, and all of them have been insufficient. Unlike our creedal cousins, we have long understood that whatever it is that brings us together ultimately is beyond something that we can name. Trinitarian Christians believe that the verbal essence of their theological perspective can be captured in statements like the Nicene Creed, but we do not. The intended revisions to Article 2, like many of their predecessors, will be insufficient. They'll be insufficient because, as Teresa Soto has said, there is something between us that we cannot tame and cannot measure. My words, your words, our words, words of any kind, will never fully capture the fullness of faith. Our faith is found more in the things we do together, the rituals we share, the actions we take in the public square, than in any statement, be it the current or future version of some principles or some article. Faith is caught up in all of the rituals that we do share that help us make it through the inevitable I don't want tos of life. The big rites of passage and the subtle, small, steady, simple act of gathering together on a Sunday morning. Whatever language we choose, however we choose to speak of our living tradition, we will remain a congregation that assembles to widen the circle of love, bring more justice into the world, and accompany each other on life's journey. Over the next year, the Unitarian Universalist Association has invited all of us into a discussion about our principles and sources. Today, after the service in the fireside room, if you wish, there will be an opportunity to discuss the proposed Article 2, and we'll be hosting other discussions in coming months. The association will have a vote at this year's General Assembly on the language of the proposed amendment, and then we'll spend a year trying to live with it and see if we like using it. After that, there'll be an opportunity to vote on it again at the 2024 General Assembly, and some opportunities for you through delegates at General Assembly to have input on whether you like the language or not. And then there will be a new permanent statement of Unitarian Universalist theological perspective in the articles. Of course, the word permanent here is a misstatement, for whatever is changed or come up with will be changed again, because that's both the dynamism and the contradiction at the heart of our movement. We are a tradition committed to change. We seek to preserve the unnameable something that cannot be named, that is between us and cannot be measured. At the same time, we recognize that each generation will experience, understand, and attempt to name that unnameable source within its own language. Here then is where I leave you this morning, a blessing inspired by the essence of our living tradition. May we find in the work of this religious community inspiration to be open to change, and comfort in the steady rituals it offers, a reminder that though we cannot fully name that something between us, though we might speak of it differently from generation to generation, it remains here in these sacred walls, a source of love and justice in our lives. That it might be so, I invite the congregation to say, Amen.